because if I do that one, I think fairness requires that I treat everybody exactly the same. And, when it's not an essay, it's easy enough to do that. So anyway, when I make a key of that, it might have, I don't know, there could be 20 to 25 to 30 different points that I'm looking for, corresponding to a bunch of the things that I talked about under the heading of, common wisdom or false wisdom about abortion or abortion nonsense, as I sometimes call it. So for sure I want two, and there might be more than one in a sentence. Sometimes people will say two things, and I want you to talk about both of them. Sometimes people use the language improperly, and I want you to comment on that, as I've said in class a bunch of times. So for sure, there are a number of different points I'm looking for, and I'm sure it's more than 20, probably somewhere in the 25 to 30 point zone, but you're not going to actually be able to figure out how to count them that way. It's just, there's a lot in there. Don't, make up stuff that I didn't talk about. But if I talked about it and said, okay, let's do another one. Here's two of them. I often would even number them. After a while, I kind of lost track of the numbers, but I distinguish them, you should too. So let's stick with the first question. Since Megan asked about that, what else would you like to know about that? You can ask about the parts that I haven't talked about. I'm happy to just give you an outline of that, but I'm going to spend time on Tuesday finishing up Thompson and finishing up the last few of the pieces of abortion nonsense, and they'll be right in front of your minds. Get one of the other good questions. So what else about that? Kevin, views work better when you come prepared and then you know which parts you don't know about. It's early enough that it's hard to, expect everybody to be prepared. But if you're counting on other people asking, they might be no more prepared than you are. And if nobody asks, I just go home. So let's see what we see. Kevin, yeah.
What's prima facie objectionable?
Prima facie objectionable means, at least on the surface, it looks like it's objectionable. So, for example, when we talk about when one of the people says that abortion should be permissible, at least after rape, you know that I think Thompson makes a pretty amazing argument to show that even if a fetus is a person, it probably is permissible. At least a lot of people are going to have to believe it's permissible given their other moral commitments to have an abortion after rape. If they think that it's okay to disconnect the violinist, and they think that the situations are parallel in terms of the burdens on somebody, I may end up taking that back, but I don't want you to get to that level if you get question one. I want you to stay at the level of the first look, first philosophical look. So what's prima facie objectionable about that is that it seems like if a fetus has a right to life, then the fetus has a right to life no matter how it was produced. And they're just as innocent, the fetus is innocent, even if the rapist has done something really awful. So that's all you'd want to say about that. You wouldn't want to go into Thompson because that's getting far beyond the prima facie level. It means first face or first look. In this case, first philosophical look, because the first look is the look that comes from false wisdom.
Are we kind of supposed to say if the fetus is nope. I don't know if we're supposed to pick one or if we're supposed to argue both sides.
Neither. The problem with these arguments is that they, so for several of these arguments where right to life is an issue, they take the miserable life argument. So somebody says, the fetus is going to have a miserable life, therefore it's okay to perform an abortion. Well, if you thought it was a being that had a right to life, you wouldn't think that it is morally permissible to kill it in order to prevent it from having a miserable life. And I can prove that to you, I think, by showing you that if we imagine that a kid has now been born and it's lived for 2 years, and then the doctors come and tell you something about it that makes you clear that it's going to have an unsatisfactory life in many respects. I don't mean a life of constant torture or something like that, where that might really present a moral issue, whether to kill it or not. But it's just going to be as unhappy as you imagine an unwanted child would be, right? Remember that something to note there is that it's often exaggerated how miserable the life is going to be. There are people in this room who are adopted and whose lives have not been miserable. And, the idea that they can be killed because they're going to have a miserable life is wrong for that reason as well. They weren't going to have a miserable life. But let's suppose we knew it was going to have a miserable life, the 2-year-old. As miserable as an unwanted child, you know, so it's going to be passed from foster home to foster home and lots of bad stuff. Like that, nobody would think it's okay to kill that 2-year-old in order to prevent it from having that sort of miserable life. So the person must be presupposing that the fetus doesn't have a right to life. But that presupposition is undefended, and the argument from miserable life doesn't get you to abortion being permissible, right? Unless you add in that a fetus isn't a person. But if you could show that, you don't even need the miserable life because you could kill it anyway.
But then it's like, you don't know if it's a real person or not.
That's right.
So.
The point is just that in the absence of knowing that, the argument doesn't go through the argument doesn't go through unless you can show that the fetus is a non-person. But if you could show that, you don't need this shit about miserable life in order to make your point, right? And so the argument as it stands doesn't show anything, really. And it's not a matter of, well, but if it doesn't have a right to life, then that argument works. No, that argument doesn't work at all. The argument isn't doing any of the work, right? It's the non-personhood that's doing the work of showing abortion to be permissible, right? So if we could show that the fetus is not a person, then abortion would be permissible, even if the fetus wasn't going to have a miserable life. It's having a miserable life is just irrelevant to whether abortion's okay or not. That's only convincing to people who already think that a fetus isn't a person. If they could show that, then they wouldn't. Then that would be their argument, not the miserable life part. The miserable life part is not getting them any mileage whatsoever, except rhetorically. You know, it might convince people. And of course, if fetuses aren't persons, then there are lots of reasons why we should make abortion available and cheap and unstigmatized, etc. And they have to do with the cost that many people endure as a result. But as things stand, the argument doesn't carry any weight whatsoever. And notice that in saying that, I didn't have to make any assumptions about whether a fetus has a right to life or doesn't have a right to life. The argument doesn't work because it overlooks that question. If you could answer that question, you wouldn't need the miserable life part. If you can't answer that question, the miserable life part doesn't help. The miserable life part is doing zero argumentative work. Rhetorically, it might be powerful for some people, but that's because people are confused. Yep.
Is that in some way or another the answer for all of these
It's
claims,
not.
then?
It is for some of them, a number of them, but not for all of them. It is for all of the hardship arguments. They have, the arguments that I call hardship arguments have that in common. And there may be others that have that in common with the hardship arguments. I don't know. So what are some of the hardship arguments? Miserable life. Poor 13-year-old, right? Her life being ruined somehow. Overpopulation is a hardship on society, right? What else? Equality might be a hardship issue, right? Because women not being able to achieve equality is a hardship on women. Miserable life. I can't come up with any others offhand, but I bet there are several others that I'm overlooking that if I saw the page, I'd be able to point to. They're all hardship arguments because they say something's going to be bad for somebody, and therefore it's okay to have an abortion. And the answer is, even if that thing is really going to be bad for that person, it wouldn't be okay to have an abortion if the fetus had the same right to life that you have, just as it wouldn't be okay to kill you in circumstances like that. And the hardship doesn't justify abortion if the fetus is a person, and isn't necessary if the fetus is a non-person. All of those overlook the right to life issue. But for example, the death penalty comparisons, that's not the problem. Right? The problem isn't that they overlook, the problem is that they accuse the other side of inconsistency when the other side isn't inconsistent. And to show that, you'd want to show how somebody could consistently hold the two positions, that are being juxtaposed there. And it's important not to switch the two. For example, the stuff about language, calling one side pro-life is a mistake, I think. It's an unfair, it's a kind of argumentative theft to do that because it pretends that the other side is anti-life or pro-death. That has nothing to do with the right to life issue. Science, I don't know if we got to that or not, but I've got a record of it somewhere, but in one place I say someday science will prove that a fetus is a person. And that's one of the ones that has two sides, right? Because certainly scientific evidence is relevant to the question of whether a fetus has a right to life. We need to know what it's like in order to make an informed judgment about that moral question. So I don't want to deny that scientific knowledge is relevant to moral decision making. It's often extremely important. On the other hand, it can't resolve the question of whether somebody has a right to life or not. You can't find a right to life under a microscope. The problem there isn't that they've overlooked the right to life issue. The problem is that science can't establish whether something has a right to life or not. And that's a very different issue from begging your question by sneaking in the assumption that the fetus doesn't have a right to life, which is actually doing all the work for you in the argument. You know what I mean by doing all the work in the argument? I keep using that expression. You know what I mean by that? Making the conclusion seem plausible to you, right? So you would not be tempted to think that it was okay to kill 2-year-olds because you think that a particular 2-year-old is going to have a miserable life. That's because you think 2-year-olds have a right to life, just like you do. And they can't be killed just for that reason.